Claire, thanks for making time to talk to me today about what you're doing at ABTA, the Travel Association, on sustainability. I wanted to start by asking you what you think the impact of COVID has been. We know it's been terrible for the industry, but I don't particularly want to talk about that because we all know that story. But what I did want to talk about is what it's done to people's expectation, or the amount of trust that they expect to be able to put on a tour operator or a travel agent. And I mean, my parents' generation, which is a long time ago now, the trust was about whether the hotel was where it said it was in the brochure and whether in fact it was finished when you got on the plane to go out there. That's gone. That isn't any longer much of an issue. But COVID has obviously brought trust right back to the front of the agenda. Do you think that's a bit of a game changer, or am I just being too optimistic?
I think you're absolutely right. And I think COVID has shaped this, but I think it's important to remember that we were seeing this trend before COVID as well. So, I mean, we've been tracking consumer trends for the last 10 years, and they've been consistently going up. So, the importance of sustainability to consumers has more than doubled since we started tracking it. And I mean, what kind of surprised me was that we continued to track it during COVID. And whilst, yes, of course, other areas became more important to customers, sustainability was still important when they were thinking about traveling in the future and what they would care about. In fact, a lot of consumers said they were going to be more concerned about various areas of sustainability. So I think we're building on that trend. And I think what's shaping when travel businesses are thinking about sustainability and feeling that pressure to address sustainability, yes, it's from the consumers, and yes, it's from media, but it's also from their staff. We are seeing that legislation ramp up as well, and also that threat of future legislation, and it's investors now as well, whether that's shareholders or private equity, really having a strong influence on companies and that importance of sustainability.
In the same series as this, Claire, I interviewed Eric Ricorte from Greenview. He was talking about the pressure that's coming from companies like BlackRock for major change in the hospitality sector in particular. Can we come though to what's happening in your world, in ABTA, the Travel Association's world, around encouraging your members to adopt sustainability? And I also know you do a lot of work with destinations around the same issues. So should we maybe start with the economic?
Yeah, so towards the end of last year, we launched Tourism Good, which is a framework for how travel and tourism is addressing sustainability. And picking up on what you were saying just before, I think that is just as relevant now, because it was all about embedding sustainability in the recovery. It's just as relevant now. And we've put that framework together, looking at what sustainability means in travel and tourism. And we broke it down into environment, so very much decarbonisation and climate change, but also things like circular economy, waste, plastics, etc. Environment, destination impact and community impact. And picking up on the economic, that are we benefiting local economies being a really key part of that. Human rights being the third piece, whether that's child safeguarding, labour conditions, particularly important with the Modern Slavery Act, but also more broadly than that. Anti-discrimination towards sort of more proactive diversity and inclusion processes, accessible tourism, etc. And then the fourth area being animal welfare. So we are working with our members on tackling all of those areas in their operations, their supply chain, with their customers. And I think particularly, one of the areas that's coming to the fore at the moment that we're really focusing on with our members is climate change.
How are your members responding to that agenda? Because the point I've been making all along is that really there's almost nothing that ABTA or either the travel agents or the tour operators can do unless they own an airline.
Yeah.
do about the biggest problem, which is aviation. I mean, in a sense, travel and tourism is a victim of aviation still heavily using fossil fuels, isn't it?
I mean, it's an interesting take. I think certainly in the past, perhaps the tourism industry, particularly for those that have felt that they can't influence the biggest part of their footprint, and so therefore that they've sort of perhaps jumped straight to offsetting. And I think what we're trying to do with our members is help them think, well, actually, let's map their emissions, let's map all of the areas of their emissions, and think about, well, what can they control and what can they influence, and use that to kind of focus the mind to then think about what reduction activities they can take. And then, absolutely, I think it's important that we think beyond aviation to all the other bits of travel and tourism that we can control and influence. But on aviation, ABTA is a member of Sustainable Aviation, which is a coalition of airlines, manufacturers, airports, because we think it's really important that we are not only supporting the industry to transition to net zero by 2050, but also making sure we're making the policy asks to make sure we can get there too.
So we saw the British government come out a couple of days ago with their what they obviously think is a stretch target of 10% SAF by 2035. How do us have to see that?
So, I mean, it's certainly welcoming that investment in SAF, sustainable aviation fuels. I think we want to see that development of sustainable aviation fuel here in the UK. We think that will be a stronger impact and narrative for customers to see that actually, yes, that is the fuel that is going into their airplane is more sustainable aviation fuel. So I think these are all great announcements. These things will take time, but I think it's about supporting that innovation and seeing tangible action. Now, I mean, we will be seeing flights coming into the climate change conference COP26 using sustainable aviation fuel. But yeah, absolutely, we want to see action, and we want to see it happen as quickly as possible.
I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about aviation because I suspect you and I significantly disagree on it. But 10% by 2035 of a fuel which still emits carbon when it's burnt, it's not a very big target, is it? Given the scale of the problem. I mean, the German consultancy firm, which estimated that on current trends, aviation would be 25% of all emissions by 2050. If that isn't changed, that will be an absolute disaster for travel and tourism, because what's going to happen then is that governments will stop people flying. They'll regulate it and stop it because it will be such a big part of the problem. And it worries me that there isn't a sufficient sense of urgency in what for me is an industry I care about passionately, about moving to a genuinely carbon-free future.
So, I mean, I think it is important to say that, at the sustainable aviation level, so in the UK, but also at the European level, and hopefully soon at the world level, there is that commitment to net zero, and through sustainable aviation, there is that plan. So that is a really clear roadmap for how you get to net zero by 2050. There's the interim targets of 15% by 2030 and 40% by 2040. Now, completely agreed, that is a later transition than other sectors. I think it's, I think everyone would acknowledge that aviation is difficult to decarbonize, but there is that plan, and there is that plan within that time frame of 2050, and there is action. So the action that we've seen to date, a lot of it has been about improving efficiency, airspace modernization. I think we can see action on that very quickly. I think we're going to start seeing impact from sustainable aviation from now, and then later on that will be when other technologies start coming in as well. But I agree with you that we need to be showing as an industry this continual progress, and that we are meeting that roadmap and we're following that plan in order to effectively build that trust that we will reach net zero and we are decarbonising.
Just one last comment maybe on this, and then let's move on. But I mean, it's one thing for the travel and tourism industry in the UK not to be able to send people abroad on aircraft, and we've had an experience of that with COVID. At least in the UK, you can switch around, or at least some operators can, and do domestic tourism. If you're in the Gambia and you're in tourism, it's a very different scenario, isn't it? Because there's no opportunity there for domestic tourism. It worries me enormously that I don't want my children or grandchildren to live in a world where flying has become something which is regarded with such opprobrium because of the damage it does to the climate, that government's actually regulated out of existence. And I just don't think there's enough of a sense of urgency about the transition. But we probably just have to agree to disagree about that, Claire. Move on.
But I mean, I think that's a really powerful point, that, you know, tourism, the importance of tourism to not only here in the UK in terms of jobs and livelihoods, but very much jobs and livelihoods in destinations. You know, that's why it's so important that we ensure that we do embed sustainability in the recovery. And it's not just jobs and livelihoods either. We've seen through the pandemic the impact that tourism has in terms of benefiting culture or better benefiting nature. So yeah, it's vital that we ensure we build back sustainably.
One of the, you asked me before this interview started about the other interviews I've done in this series.
Yeah.
And there's an absolutely wonderful interview that I did with the guy who is called John Coplin. He's 87. He proudly told me, but he's the guy who has developed for Rolls-Royce their most efficient engine in terms of the weight of the engine and the amount of thrust by a long way. His record with that's never been broken. But there's a clip which I'm having taken out, it's being edited out now so as I can show it separately, of him just saying, for goodness sake, accept the science, accept that hydrogen flying is not impossible, give the engineers the challenge, and we'll make it possible for the tourism industry to grow again. And it's just the most wonderful thing to hear from an 87-year-old. And I thought that's actually how I feel about it too, that really we've got to get over this and make that very radical shift so that your members and all the other people involved in travel and tourism. And he then went on to give a really powerful explanation. He ended up working, sorry to take up so much of the interview, but he ended up working in Indonesia, helping them to buy the very best of British technology. He was working for the DTI or whatever, and he just went on and on about how important actual personal contact was in terms of building trust and developing leisure and business tourism. And it was one of the most impassioned statements about the importance of tourism I've ever heard. And there it is, coming from an 87-year-old engineer. You know, it was a powerful thing. And I do think we need to remind the aviation industry that it needs to shape up and facilitate this change at a much more rapid pace. But let's leave it there, Claire. What else? Should we talk about the social impact? You talked about the importance of recognizing the contribution that tourism makes in so many countries around the world. And ABTA has begun to do quite a lot of work, I think, in terms of trying to increase the value of tourism and the value both in terms of the contribution to national revenue, but also to better quality jobs in tourism in many places around the world. And obviously that must have been incredibly difficult during COVID. Really, really difficult. But do you see, as we come past COVID, more opportunity for that to take off now?
Yeah, I do. I mean, during COVID, there were some really, I think, powerful examples of, for example, travel foundations stepping in and trying to support communities with what they could during these times. Obviously, it's almost a drop in the ocean to what was needed, because we do know that there wasn't that safety net from some governments and destinations around the world. So it's going to be really tough to build back, because obviously when you have increased vulnerability, you have increased risk, and I think that's something that we as an industry will need to be mindful of. in terms of destinations. But yes, I think some of the things, for example, that our members are doing now as we build back, it's ensuring those supplier codes of conducts are embedded across environmental and social criteria. Travel Life for hotels is a really powerful tool for our members to use, because that does look at those social criteria as well, and those human rights aspects. And I think also it's about working with destinations and understanding, you know, a lot of destinations have rethought their tourism strategy in the wake of COVID. So how can the industry better understand and collaborate with that destination in order to deliver on well-managed, well-delivered, developed tourism?
Are you finding a ready response from your members, or are they still, I imagine, to be honest, Claire, that they're still in the survival stage, aren't they?
I have been continually impressed with how sustainability has stayed on the agenda. I was working in sustainability during the financial crash, and I saw sort of almost, you know, literally, you know, in a timescale of weeks. It really did, and that was what I was expecting, and I didn't see that. And considering what the industry has gone through, I find that astounding. What I saw was perhaps the person that I'd been working with on sustainability, you know, had been furloughed. I saw, well, I would have their boss come to my meetings. You know, I have managing directors coming to my sustainability committees, which, you know, was really heartening. We've seen announcements from travel companies, you know, in the last year and a half, new sustainability strategies, announcements of certifications, for example. And then now there is such, you know, yes, it's super early stages. To even be using the word recovery, it feels almost too soon. But yet, you know, I am having the highest engagement with members that I've ever had. And, you know, you've got the leaders that have been doing this for a long time that have maintained that momentum. But we're also seeing a lot of companies coming to this agenda relatively new and wanting to learn from others in terms of how to take the first steps.
Yeah, I'm sure when you see the list, it's just been published today, the list of businesses and destinations which are on the list either to get gold, silver, or ones to watch. There are a number of UK, a number of your members are in there. And I agree with you. You talked earlier, and I didn't pick it up, but let's go back to it. You talked about the fact that these trends were in place before the pandemic, and I think that's right. My sense of it is that, and it's why I began with trust in a way, that COVID has had a catalytic effect. I mean, it's obviously created a terrible experiment if you think of it in terms of a chemistry flask in a laboratory. It's been a terrible thing that's happened, but the catalytic effect seems to have been to reassert the importance of thinking about sustainability. It's as though the whole way people think about the world has been to something, not a massive shift, but a bit of a shift towards thinking that sustainability really matters.
I think that's right. And I think this also sort of ties back to kind of climate change, because I think we've often, you know, it's easy to think about some of these external forces that we're talking about as somehow, well, that will happen to other people, that will happen in other parts of the world. Whereas I think there's been that realization that these global shifts and global impacts can affect us, our everyday lives, our jobs, our families, and I think, you know, our businesses. And I think that's been a real shift of almost like a paradigm shift of what does resilience mean? What does preparedness mean? What does innovation mean? And our kind of vulnerability to some of these global impacts. And so I think there has been, our eyes have been opened to some of those, what those future effects might be, particularly from climate change.
And in a way, the kind of members that you have, the categories, I don't mean the individual companies, but the kind of categories that you have in membership, travel agents and tour operators, they're almost doubly vulnerable, aren't they? Because they're vulnerable to what might happen in their market, in their source market in Britain, where they're primarily selling from. But they're also very vulnerable to what happens in the destination. So, okay, nobody's been going to Australia on holiday because they closed down, but there would have been an impact from how much of Australia was burnt in the fires in recent times. And of course, the flooding in Germany and in Holland and Belgium was to some extent in areas which has tourism, and they were almost literally wiped off the tourism map by the floods. And the extreme heat that we saw down on some of the Mediterranean coast similarly would have made it very difficult for people who wanted to go on holiday down there to think about coping with 50 degrees. I mean, at that kind of temperature, you've got a serious health risk. So in a way, the travel and tourism industry remains very vulnerable to this, in some ways more vulnerable than other kinds of industries where they're not trying to take travelers to the factory. They're not, you know, if you're just importing the goods, the price goes up. But that's very different if you're sending the tourists to places which have been fundamentally changed by climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two ways to think about that, and I actually see parallels with sort of agriculture here, and that, you know, the kinds of, you know, if you're a tour operator or an agent, to some extent you have flexibility about where to go. You are certainly more flexible than a hotel in a destination.
Yeah.
But that said, I think it is still very much within our industries. It's important that our industry encourages building resilience in destination, and I think that's going to be a big focus for us. You know, we promote sustainable destination management with destinations, and a big part of that, an increasing part of that, is resilience to these changes.
And are you finding destinations responsive to that?
I mean, I think it varies. I think, you know, in destinations like the Caribbean, I think they've realized this quite early on. I think partly because of you know, because of where they are and histories of hurricanes. It's easy to understand what may be coming down the line. And so I think destinations are at different places on realizing the importance of that. I think the quality of data that's available also will shape to what extent a destination can prepare. So for example, the National Trust in the UK has done some incredible mapping for how climate change will shape their long-term strategy. And you know, will people want to go to houses in the summer if temperatures are over kind of 40 degrees? How will their coastal properties be affected? And I would love sort of that level of data to be more available for destinations around the world for that kind of planning.
Yes, and the problem with climate is that whilst we know what's happening on the averages, the way that plays out in terms of the weather systems is still very unpredictable. Weather is always going to be unpredictable.
Yeah, and so, I mean, we're at COP26, you know, we're looking ahead to COP26 coming up. We know that there'll be a number of announcements. For example, we'll see the launch of the Glasgow Declaration for tourism. And I think, so we have a webinar on the 11th of the month of November to kind of pull all of this together, to kind of summarize it, you know, so what does this mean for travel businesses, and to help travel businesses look ahead to navigate this landscape going forward.
I said to you before we started this interview, Claire, that I admire you very much for taking that on. I don't think that's going to be an easy task at all. It'll be really interesting to see how the debate at COP26 develops. I wanted to probably begin to wrap this up by reminding you that we are launching this platform for change, and I'm really keen that the platform carries the idea behind the platform for change is to help people find solutions which have been tried and tested, and you will come across things which should be on that platform. I'd be very grateful if you'd point people in our direction. We're really just looking for things which will make a difference, because frankly we need we can't have everybody making experiments to see what works. We need people to build on the back of those who've already had the experiments and found out what works, because we clearly, as President Biden has said, you know, this is the critical decade. I may not live to see the end of it, but you probably will. And we need to accelerate change as much as we can. And I think you and I are both in a position to assist with that by helping people to find things.
Yeah,
Is there anything else you want
to
add, Claire, as we come to the end? Is there anything we've not covered that you would like to say?
No, I was just going to say, yes, I think we both have almost, you know, similar roles there, that, you know, through that kind of convening power and sharing those examples and using that to inspire others, I think we can play a role in accelerating change. And I think that is an important role. So yeah, I think both you and I have similar roles to play there. Nothing more to add from me, but just it's been really good to chat with you, and thank you very much for having the conversation.
Claire, thank you. And it's literally an open door to you and everybody else who will watch this video, that if you do know of things that work, and if they're not already on the platform, please send them to us and we'll put them up. Thanks, Claire.